In this video, we will go through cycling of matter and Earth spheres. Ecosystems can be large or small, and they overlap and interconnect. We'll talk about the different parts that exist. So there is the biosphere. This is the part of the planet, including water, land, and air, where life exists. So this is like planet Earth. And in the biosphere, it's a very thin relative to the whole Earth. We don't find organisms too far down into the Earth. So it's a very thin layer where life occupies Earth. So the biosphere is composed of the atmosphere, lithosphere, and hydrosphere. So the atmosphere is the layer of gases that surrounds Earth. Water vapor and carbon dioxide absorb sunlight and retain the sun's energy, and this helps heat our planet. There's the lithosphere, and this is Earth's solid outer layer. It includes the rigid crust in the upper mantle and the soil. The hydrosphere includes all the water on Earth. 97% of the water is salt water, and 3% is fresh water in lakes, streams, and glaciers. So this diagram just highlights the different parts of the biosphere. So we have the atmosphere, that thin layer of gases. It is a very thin layer. We have the lithosphere, which is basically the lithosphere, which is basically the ground, and we have the hydrosphere, which is the watery parts. So now, dealing with nutrient cycles and looking at these different components of the biosphere, keep in mind that ecosystems provide living things with the matter they need, including nutrients. So that matter can be in the form of nutrients or other things that an organism would need to survive. So matter can be classified as organic or inorganic substances. Organic substances always contain atoms of carbon and hydrogen that are bonded together. So oftentimes organic substances will contain atoms of oxygen and nitrogen. So organic substances would include proteins, sugars, and fats. Organic substances can also include things like oil and gasoline and natural gas. Those contain carbon and hydrogen together. Inorganic substances do not contain a combination of carbon and hydrogen. So, for example, there's carbon dioxide, water, and ammonia. And if you look at the chemical formula for each of these substances, carbon dioxide is CO2, it contains carbon, but no hydrogen. Water is H2O and contains hydrogen, but no carbon. Ammonia has the chemical formula NH3, and it contains hydrogen, but no carbon. So these would be inorganic substances. And so we can define nutrients now as chemicals that are needed by living things and are continually cycled through ecosystems. With cycling of matter, matter must be recycled. The atoms that make up our bodies have all been somewhere else before. The food we eat is broken down into smaller molecules and then rebuilt into the complex molecules we need. What helps with the cycling of matter are decomposers. They will break down organic materials, so waste or dead organisms, into smaller inorganic molecules and make available to other living things. So this diagram here just shows an example of cycling of matter. So for example, with carbon dioxide, which is inorganic, it can get taken up by plants. Those plants can get eaten by animals, and those animals can die, and then their decomposing bodies are broken down by bacteria in the soil, and that bacteria will then release those compounds as inorganic molecules, those nutrients, which plants can use. And so in this way, matter is cycled throughout an ecosystem. So sometimes matter can move back and forth between different components of an ecosystem and may not be unavailable, and so these are reservoirs. So sometimes matter can move back and forth between the abiotic and biotic parts of an ecosystem. Occasionally it moves a lot slower, and this slow movement creates an accumulation or buildup of matter called a reservoir. For example, some ice glaciers have been around for years and thousands of years and tens of thousands of years. So a glacier, which is just a large sheet of ice, would be a reservoir of water. And as it slowly melts, it can be a source of drinking water. With the water cycle, this describes how water is moved through the whole biosphere. Water enters the atmosphere by transpiration, which is basically water vapor from trees, so water that gets released from trees in the form of water vapor is done so through this process of transpiration. There is evaporation, where water vapor comes from a body of water, and respiration, which is water vapor from breathing. So when you exhale, you release water out into the atmosphere. Water may run along the ground and collect in a lake or ocean, and this is referred to as runoff, or it may percolate in the soil and form underground bodies of water, which are referred to as aquifers. And so this diagram just shows the different ways in which water cycles through our biosphere. So water enters that atmosphere through that process of evaporation, transpiration, and respiration. It's not on here, but it contributes. And that water will eventually condense, will precipitate, and that precipitation will end up in lakes and streams, which eventually go into the oceans. Some of this water will seep into the ground, forming these aquifers, which eventually do end up in the ocean. With the carbon cycle, keep in mind that carbon is the key element for all living things. Plants use carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, and then cellular respiration releases carbon dioxide back into the environment. Carbon can also be returned to the environment by decomposition. So when something dies and it starts to decay and is broken down, the carbon that is within that organism can be released. And carbon can also be returned to the environment by burning fossil fuels. So this is more of a human process, but it does return carbon into the environment. So fossil fuels are trapped carbon, which when burned gets released back into the environment. So this diagram here just goes through the carbon cycle. So, here we have CO2 in the atmosphere. That CO2 in the atmosphere gets taken out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis by plants. Plants also perform respiration and can release CO2 back into the atmosphere. Those plants and trees can be consumed by animals who also do respiration and release that CO2 into the atmosphere. Plants and animals can die, and as they decay, bacteria will break them down, releasing that CO2 into the atmosphere. And then sometimes, under specific conditions, things that die will eventually become fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are things like coal, oil, and gas, which are basically carbon reservoirs. And then, we as humans go and dig those things up, use them to power our homes, our vehicles, basically our way of life. And in burning those fossil fuels, this releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. Now, there are reservoirs for inorganic carbon, so the atmosphere is one of them, and this contains a small percentage of CO2, and this is what is available to land plants for photosynthesis. The oceans can also act as a reservoir for inorganic carbon. and acts and that CO2 can be available to algae and plants for photosynthesis. Now, CO2 in the water will react with water to form a compound called carbonates, which has this molecular formula here, and bicarbonates, which has this molecular formula here. These can combine with calcium to produce calcium carbonate, and calcium carbonate is what's used to form shells and exoskeletons. Earth's crust is also a big reservoir for inorganic carbon. Most carbonate in the ocean ends up as sediment, and this eventually becomes bedrock. With reservoirs of inorganic carbon, they're held in bodies of water, and decomposition eventually returns the carbon to the cycle in an inorganic form. However, some ecosystems, such as bogs, store huge quantities of organic carbon, this dead plant matter in a form called peat, because the decomposition is slow. There's a lack of oxygen in these bogs, and so things decompose very slowly. The slow decaying organic matter eventually becomes coal, and a similar situation occurs on the ocean floor, and the trapped organic carbon becomes oil. Now, there is a human impact on these carbon reservoirs, and the human impact is the release of carbon from organic reservoirs faster than normal by mining. So when we dig up coal, burning fossil fuels, burning that coal, for example, burning forests to make way for farmlands and agriculture, and clearing vegetation for building. The last cycle we'll go through is the nitrogen cycle, and nitrogen atoms are required so cells can make things like proteins and DNA. And the atmosphere is composed majority of nitrogen gas, 78% of it is nitrogen gas. And nitrogen gas is very stable and is not usable by living organisms. Nitrogen gas thus has to be converted into a usable form, and that usable form is a compound we call nitrates. Nitrates are the same thing that you use to preserve cured meats, your lunch meats. And so looking at this diagram that shows the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen cycling through our environment. So if we start with atmospheric nitrogen, this is nitrogen in our atmosphere. This can get converted into nitrates through several different means here. There's nitrogen fixing bacteria. These bacteria are capable of taking nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere and turning it into nitrates. Lightning can also help create nitrates as well. These nitrates get absorbed by plants, which can use those nitrates to create things like proteins and DNA, and any other compounds containing nitrogen. When those plants get eaten by animals, those nitrogen-containing compounds get transferred to the animals. They get digested and then absorbed by those animals that can use them for their own proteins and DNA. And eventually, plants and animals will die, and as they decay, that nitrogen, those nitrates and nitrogen-containing compounds get turned into ammonia, which has the formula NH3. Which through bacterial action, through different bacteria, they can either break down that ammonia and turn it back into atmospheric nitrogen, or they can take that ammonia and turn it back into nitrates, which helps cycle that nitrogen through that ecosystem. Nitrogen gas can be converted into nitrates in a process called nitrogen fixation. So as we talked about in the diagram, this can occur in two ways. So lightning can cause nitrogen fixation to happen. So the energy within lightning will cause nitrogen gas to react with oxygen, producing those nitrates. Bacteria can perform nitrogen fixation as well. So they're found in the soil or nodules, on roots or of legumes. And then decomposers as well can break down nitrogen-containing compounds in the waste or body into ammonia. Other bacteria will break down NH3 ammonia into nitrites. Nitrites have the chemical compound NO2, and then convert those nitrites into nitrates, which is NO3. Some bacteria converts nitrites into nitrates and then nitrates into nitrogen gas. This process is called denitrification. So these bacteria here will take nitrates and eventually convert them back into nitrogen gas, returning that nitrogen gas into the atmosphere. So that is the end of this video for Earth spheres and cycling of matter.